Hi, I'm Kathryn Jean Lopez from the National Review Institute, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this discussion about the Religious Freedom Institute's new report, Religious Pro-Life Americans Under Attack, a Threat Assessment of Post-Dobbs America. We're talking about the new culture we're seeing of violence against both pro-life ministries and churches because of abortion and their opposition to abortion. And I'm delighted that the Religious Freedom Institute is co-sponsoring this with the National Review Institute. And I'm also honored to be a media fellow at the Religious Freedom Institute. So thank you, Nathaniel Hurd from the Religious Freedom Institute. And thank you, Grazie Christie, who actually volunteers as a radiologist at one of the pro-life centers that has been attacked since the Dobbs leak in May. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what happened there and your work there. One of the most shocking things about the attacks, particularly on the pro-life ministries, is, as Tom Farr from the Religious Freedom Institute said in his release, these are the places that actually help women. These are places that we should bipartisanly support. But instead we have senators calling to close them down, or governors investigating them, as Kathy Hochul is in New York. Nathaniel, can you talk a little bit about the report, what you found, and what we need to take from it?
Sure, thanks, Kathryn, and it's good to be with you today. The report focuses on two main things: the attacks on pro-life pregnancy resource centers, and then also pro-life education and advocacy groups. And what we saw after the leak of the Dobbs opinion was a surge in criminal attacks on these organizations. So 63 of these organizations were attacked. This was not a localized thing. It was across 26 states, plus the District of Columbia. A significant percentage of these are religious, which means that the organizations themselves are intentionally religious. One thing I should just point out about pregnancy resource centers in particular is that even those that are not institutionally religious, many of them are staffed and have volunteers with people who are there out of a deep religious conviction. So there really is a very important religious freedom dimension to this. The other thing that we note in the report is that these attacks are really an outgrowth of violent criminal attacks on Catholic sites, primarily churches, going back to late May of 2020, when people who associated themselves with the protests of the killing of George Floyd set fire to St. Mary's Basilica in Minneapolis. That same weekend, across multiple cities, Catholic churches were attacked. A Catholic bookstore run by the Catholic nuns in Chicago was attacked as well. And including those attacks, there have been 174 Catholic sites, mostly churches, that have been attacked across 38 states, plus the District of Columbia. 26 instances of arson, 76 of desecration of statues, literally hundreds of crimes committed against these Catholic institutions. And in both instances, the attacks on the pro-life organizations and the Catholic sites, the response, at least at the national level, from the Department of Justice, the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, and certainly the national media, has mostly been silence.
So before the Dobbs leak, you had law enforcement officials contribute to this report. What was the reason before the Dobbs leak? Do you have any sense of that?
So the person who we work with, it was very important to us that in terms of the threat analysis and the threat forecasting, we wanted that to be as rigorous as possible. And so we worked in collaboration with someone who is a longtime FBI counterterrorism and intelligence expert, is no longer with the FBI. So he's retired and has a security consulting business. But while there have been criminal attacks on pro-life organizations before, none of us can really recall, at least in recent times, a spasm of violence like this. And I think what's just so striking is, I mean, there are all these caricatures that are being put out there by politicians and commentators and others about these organizations. I mean, what are we really talking about? You'll hear more from Dr. Christie, but I volunteered and was a board member for a pregnancy resource center and maternity home here in Washington, D.C. What do they do day to day? They provided diapers for babies. They helped women with connect to social services. They provided emotional support, all of the things that you need when you were in a pregnancy situation. And then for women who really had nowhere to go, they provided shelter for them. These are the places that are under attack right now.
And I should say, I'm sure there are outliers out there, but the vast majority of these women's care centers, whether they're providing medical care or they're providing educational resources or material resources, the ones that are part of Heartbeat International, for instance, but not exclusively, sign a pledge to not mislead, to be beacons of love and service to women. And so these are not fake clinics, as politicians have suggested. These are people doing the real work. This is not political. I'm sure a lot of the people who work or volunteer, vote pro-life, but it's not about politics, because abortion shouldn't be about politics. It goes deeper than that. Obviously, politics has to be a part of it in law, but on the ground, it's about caring for women in desperate situations so often.
You referred to the New York State probe into pregnancy centers. What's really striking about that law is in the text itself, there's a very clear presumption that if a pregnancy center does not provide abortions or refer for abortions, then the information that they provide to women is coercive.
Right.
The term that is used in the statute is coercive and coercion, which is really extraordinary. Anyone who knows anything about these organizations knows that they are very transparent about their underlying principles, about the inherent dignity of human life, starting at conception, and about the services that they provide, about the support that they provide, and the fact that they don't provide abortion and enable abortions in any way. They're very open and transparent about that. There's nothing coercive about it.
Yeah, again, over my years, I've heard maybe one story about somewhere where a volunteer was being trying to hide what they were doing, or it's an outlier if it happens. But I'll admit, human beings are flawed, but this is not the way these organizations are run. Grazie, will you talk a little bit about your clinic, the attack on it, and what you do there?
Yeah, before I get to that, if I could address the coercion issue before I forget. We know at the clinic that women, after visiting us, sometimes go on to have an abortion of that same pregnancy that we've diagnosed for them, that we've done a blood test and an ultrasound, and there's no attempt to bar the door and say you can't go get an abortion across the street. Very often, the Planned Parenthood offices or abortion clinics are just across the street.
Right.
The abortion clinics are heavily advertised. They're heavily funded by the government in many ways. They get all the people, women know they exist. They know they can get an abortion. They're probably paid for by Medicaid, depending where you live. So the coercion is the furthest thing from our minds. We exist to give women and their husbands or boyfriends or their extended families who want to keep the child that already exists, who want to welcome that child into the world, into their arms. We give them we give them assistance to make the choice that they want to make. It's as simple and as beautiful as that. And it's amazing to hear our centers being introduced like that in the press and in legislative sessions and by governors and senators. It's really tremendous how ugly that is. So in our place, the Archdiocese of Miami runs 3 pregnancy resource centers. One of our centers is in Broward, and that's the one that was vandalized in a very ugly fashion over Memorial Day weekend. And in all 3 of them, we do the same thing. These are very modest establishments, very nondescript. They don't have huge signs on them. If you saw the pictures of our center that was vandalized, you'd be like, "Oh, that's a pregnancy resource center." It looks like an inexpensive store at a strip mall, right? There's nothing fancy about our center, but we do tremendous work there. And the women that come to us and their families, they really, really appreciate our assistance. And as you said before, the people who work there are entirely motivated by the generosity of their hearts, by their belief that all babies and all people are made in the image of God. They are little brothers and sisters, and that it's our duty to be that compassionate outreach arm of the pro-life movement, who says, yeah, human life is precious, and here's what I'm going to do to make sure that every little tiny human life gets the chance to be born. My particular assistance there is as a radiologist, and I'm sent the ultrasound images from all 3 centers, and I interpret them for free. It's a service that I do out of my love of my fellow man and their children, and it's a beautiful part of my life. And it was very shocking to see ugly words, ugly death threats. There was a death threat that was spray painted on the doors and walls of our cheap little center in a Broward strip mall, which does so much good with very little resources.
And Kathryn, if I could just go back to this point about coercion. I mean, there is coercion, but it's not coming from the pregnancy centers. The coercion is coming from government, which is trying to force pregnancy centers through, in some cases, legislative attempts or action by the government, trying to compel them to either provide abortions or to refer women for abortions. But this violence that we've seen targeting these pro-life organizations is a form of coercion. The criminals that are behind this are trying to coerce them to either violate their convictions about the sanctity of human life by providing and referring for abortion, or coerce them into closing their doors. So if there's any coercion that's happening here, it's from the criminals and from the government.
Just a little snapshot into how crazy our culture has become. In New York, of course, it's been known as the abortion capital of the country. Abortion has been expanded in recent years. But we some of us have this little pro-life witness that happens every first Saturday of the month. And actually last Saturday, yet again, the police asked us not to process because they couldn't protect us from the counter protesters. Again, we're praying. This is what's happening. Praying the rosary across the street from Planned Parenthood. But some of the things that get screamed at you are, don't force me to give birth, by women who are not pregnant or not visibly pregnant. But no one in New York State is forcing anybody to give birth, and unfortunately abortions are on the increase at that particular Planned Parenthood since this Texas law and Dobbs leak and now the end of Roe. And so as you say, Nathaniel, like let's be serious about this. Everything in culture is pressuring girls to have an abortion. And so often if you talk to a 17-year-old girl at that clinic or at other clinics, her mother's telling her to have the abortion, her boyfriend's telling her, all of the above are telling her to have the abortion. And in this post-Roe environment, to be able to focus on these institutions that are help is really a blessed place we need to be, because that's the only thing that's going to get us out of the craziness of the politics and the rhetoric. Gracie, oh, go ahead, please, Nathan.
The only thing I was going to add is that I mean, at the heart of religious freedom is people being able to pursue their religious convictions, to live their faith out, free of coercion, free of violence, free of intimidation. And that is fundamentally why these attacks on Catholic churches, on pro-life organizations that are staffed and whose volunteers are mostly people of religious faith, that is why there's such a fundamental attack, not just on those people and on the institutions, but also on religious freedom itself.
I remember back when the HHS mandate fight was happening after Obamacare had passed, hearing from a lot of bishops on the West Coast and others saying, a lot of my immigrant people come from countries where there isn't religious freedom. And so they don't kind of see the threat, because this is kind of what governments do. So you've got that factor, and you've got the factor that people just don't believe there are religious freedom threats in the United States. And one plea I think we can make to them, if we can't grab them on the religious freedom thing initially, is we need to be a pluralistic society. Like, we need to be able to live side by side. There are a lot of people who don't agree with us on abortion. We need to be able to live together. And I often wonder if the pluralism argument might lead them to the religious freedom argument. But obviously, the religious freedom argument is foundational and critical. Why aren't we hearing about this in the media, Nathaniel? Though, because when you give the numbers since 2020, it's shocking.
To me, this is one of the great tragedies. You mentioned pluralism in the United States. We've been a multi-faith tradition country, nation since our founding, even from before our founding, in many respects. And there was a time when, if there was a violent attack on a religious institution, whether it was a church or a synagogue or a mosque or a religious organization that was run by people of religious faith, there was condemnation across the board. And at the state and local and federal level, government authorities would act swiftly. It now seems that we have two standards. There's a different standard that's being applied to people who see, for example, the question of life. When does it begin? Its dignity, its inherent worth, etc. Who see things differently. People who are pro-life. There seems to be a different standard when it comes to pursuing investigations and prosecutions and arrests and condemning these attacks. So to me, if America has arrived at a place where you can violently attack a church or a pro-life organization, literally set it on fire without any response or inadequate response from law enforcement, for people across the religious and political and philosophical spectrum, that to me is a great tragedy.
A couple of months back, Nathaniel, I did one of these virtual conversations with Steve Rasha, who's also a fellow at the Religious Freedom Institute. And we were talking about Nigeria, and he was talking about attacks on churches in Nigeria. And one of the things he said that was kind of haunting was that attacks on churches are a calling card for tyranny. These are the steps toward, particularly if you ignore it or are not shocked by it. And that's why I do think your report is important to take a look at. Gracie, you write a lot about these issues, and you and I had a conversation with your husband, who's also a medical doctor, Steve, an author of a book on pro-life arguments and rebuttals to to some of the caricatures that are out there. While we're talking about attacks on religious institutions, the argument about abortion is not a religious argument primarily. You can argue simply on the science, and it's quite clear. What made you start talking so much on these issues?
Me personally?
Yes.
It was my daughter's adoption. Our youngest daughter was adopted from China. We adopted her from China. We had four biological children, and she was one of those children that was rejected by, maybe against their will, her parents' will, but she was abandoned after birth on the side of the road. And she ended up in a Chinese orphanage, and we adopted her from China. And she was that child that is worthless. She was the worthless person, the one that has no home and no one to receive her. And even the whole country didn't want her, right? An entire nation ejected her. And she, when we brought her home and fell in love with her, it came to me very strongly that every child that we reject in abortion is just as valuable as my beautiful little girl who was a kind of princess, falling down from heaven and into our laps. And so that's what got me all fired up about making that real for people, that every child that is killed through abortion is a terrible missed opportunity of humanity, and every child should be welcomed in love. And so that's what got me into being actively pro-life. And on the science issue, I've been looking into this claim that the left makes, that the pro-choice left makes, that giving birth is 14 times as dangerous as having an abortion. And this is actually a claim that was repeated in the Dobbs case by the dissenting judges. They actually wrote that into the historical record of our nation. And it's absolutely wrong. It's not real. And that's one of the it has to do with statistics and the way you measure maternal mortality versus the way you measure abortion mortality. And you're comparing apples and oranges, and they came up with this terrible figure of 14 times. And it's not actually true. Abortion is more damaging to women's health and mortality than childbirth when you measure the numbers properly. And the statistics, you do the statistics right. And the reason I bring it up is because in our pregnancy resource centers, we're being attacked because what they say we're doing is we're keeping women from what's going to keep them safe, which is an abortion, and pushing them towards childbirth, which is so tremendously dangerous. And this claim is so erroneous, and it's being used against us. But I do think that it's just a convenient stick to beat us with. But what they're really doing is it's an assault on our religious freedom, on our freedom of conscience, which we're active. Our hearts are activated by this desire, by this knowledge that human beings are valuable. Every human being is valuable, which is a leap of the conscience of our morality, of our moral sense, of our religious sense, to go out into the world and fix this terrible thing, which is the killing of children. That's what they're fighting against, and they're using numbers and science, ill-conceived numbers and ill-conceived science as a convenient, stick. But it's really a moral attack on our freedom of conscience.
And Kathryn, one of the just to pick up on Dr. Christie's point, we point out in the report that the overwhelming majority of people in the pro-life movement, people that work at pregnancy resource centers and other pro-life organizations over the many decades, the vast majority of them are religious. However, there are pro-life atheists. There are pro-life agnostics. And I can speak about this from firsthand experience. I'm a Catholic. I became Catholic as an adult, but I'm a former atheist and a former agnostic. And I became pro-life when I was agnostic. A friend asked me a very simple question. I was making all of the arguments in favor of abortion, and he waited until I was done and asked me, "Well, when do you think life begins?" And of course, that was the question that I had avoided. That was the question that I never really wanted to consider. But it was very clear that that was the question. And as somebody who had always had a strong desire for justice, as somebody who always was very committed to the inherent worth and dignity of every person, a worth and dignity that didn't depend on location or age or capability or capacity to express yourself or any other factor other than being a live human person. The more I reflected on this, it just became clear that I had been wrong, because I wasn't beginning with the question of when does life begin. I was denying that fact. And so you don't need to be religious in order to see that. As Dr. Christie noted, I mean, the science and the medicine is very clear. And also just from a human perspective, ordinary human experience, I have 3 young children. They can recognize, my son recognized when his sister was in his mother's tummy, my wife's stomach. It was just very clear. It wasn't because we had told him that. It was just evident to him at a very sort of basic, at a very basic natural level. So these are things that we can recognize and see. However, most people who are pro-life are so because there's sort of in terms of their religious tradition, whether they are Catholics or Protestants or Muslims or Jews or some other religious tradition, the traditions have very clear things to say about the dignity of human life and the importance of protecting it.
Nathaniel, first of all, I should say that if you're watching this live and want to engage at all, ask any questions, please put your questions in the chat box. And I should also say that we've been citing this report, Religious Pro-Life Americans Under Attack, a threat assessment of post-Dobbs America, which you can find at religiousfreedominstitute.org. Nathaniel, can you explain a little bit about the Religious Freedom Institute? Because one of the things that I know that you do, besides focusing on religious freedom all around the world, is you've even got like practical tools for places of worship, churches and synagogues and mosques, for security, these security issues that unfortunately are real in the world today, in our country today, as the report makes clear.
The Religious Freedom Institute, we're a nonprofit organization based here in Washington, D.C., and our mission is very simple. It's to advance religious freedom for everyone in the United States and abroad. So people from a wide range of faith traditions. And that includes people who are pro-life. We understand and recognize that there are, vigorous debates and disagreements about critical matters like life. But if religious freedom really is for everyone, then it means that people who are religious and pro-life have a place in America and should not be shoved out of the public square. One of the things that we refer to in the report is our first public report as part of a multi-year project that we're undertaking, a multi-year investigation looking at criminal attacks on religious institutions, religious organizations, places of worship, and so forth, where the response from government authorities, particularly law enforcement, elected officials, and the media is really inadequate, is really lacking when they're ignoring these attacks. So this is our first report. We're undertaking right now the research, consulting with a range of security experts, people who were former law enforcement professionals, people who specialize in security for religious institutions, property defense, technology, cybersecurity, even mental health, because we see in some of these attacks that there's a mental health dimension to it in terms of the criminals. So we're having those consultations right now, and we'll be distilling the very best recommendations, and we'll be issuing another report very similar to this one, intended to be as useful and user-friendly as possible. We'll have recommendations for federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies. We'll have recommendations for national level and local religious organizations and institutions as well. For the, we've seen that there's a huge variance between, for example, I mean, just in the Catholic context, between individual parishes, between individual dioceses, when it comes to awareness of the threat, when it comes to taking the threat seriously, when it comes to preparedness. The gold standard in all of this is the Jewish community. No religious community in the United States is more at risk and has been attacked more over the decades than the Jewish community. The evidence for that is very clear. And so years ago, they concluded, well, we still need to press law enforcement to do its job. We also need to be as prepared as we can. And so they created an entire organization, the Secure Community Network, that is dedicated to the safety and security of the Jewish community in the United States. They have scenario training, active shooter training for individual synagogues and Jewish community centers. They have active relationships with law enforcement and so forth. So one of the things that we're hoping comes out of this is one, law enforcement, consistently investigating, arresting, and prosecuting, regardless of who the victims are, regardless of the faith tradition or moral views of the group that's being attacked. But then also religious communities themselves are really much better prepared for these kind of attacks and know how to respond.
Grazie, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that you are, your day job is you're a radiologist. You're also a senior fellow at the Catholic Association, as well as volunteering at the Pregnancy Center. The Catholic Association has done a beautiful job to insert the Catholic voice in the media more, and you do a beautiful job of that with your colleagues there. We have a question that I think that's a continuation of the conversation we had earlier, and I think is a good one. Do you think some pro-lifers fail to make a convincing secular argument? I'm certainly guilty of that at times.
I think it's a tendency that we have and that we have to fight against. My husband, you mentioned, he wrote a book that's been very successful about making having the right rebuttals to the most common pro-choice arguments. And he insists, and I believe him, that all our rebuttals ought to be strictly secular, because we just play right into their hands if we use religious arguments, which to us are very compelling, because we see everything in our lives through the lens of what we believe about ourselves and our Creator and our relationship to Him. But other people can't understand that, and it's throwing pearls before. Well, I shouldn't say that, but we shouldn't use those arguments at all. We don't have to. We have social justice arguments on our side. We have every basic humanistic ethic and creed is on our side. It's very simple. Either all men and women matter, or none. No men and women matter. So we have to use all of that. We can even use, and we have to use, the fact that abortion is bad for women. Make a society in which abortion is legal leaves women holding the bag for irresponsible men. Opens them up to a terrible scenario where a woman can never say no. And when the inevitable happens, which is that a human life is created, because that's what sex does. It creates new humans. That's its purpose, and that's what it beautifully does. Then it's a woman's responsibility to destroy that life. And that's something she carries with her, a terrible burden that crushes her back for the rest of her life, and makes her whole life a poison to her. So we can use the arguments of defending social justice, the the beautiful humanity of every human being and the dignity of every human being, those are not religious arguments. And even the argument, and especially the argument in my mind, that women are hurt by abortion.
And Kathryn, if I could just add to that, I think fundamentally it comes down to a question of freedom. Are individuals, our communities, our organizations free to make the arguments that they want to make? Some choose to make very compelling and secular arguments. Others may choose to make religious arguments. And the question is, are they free to choose one or the other? What we're seeing right now, whether it's the coercion from the government or coercion coming in the form of these violent, dangerous criminal attacks, is an attempt to force people to just set aside their religious convictions. If you think about all of the major positive social change movements in the history of the United States, abolition of slavery, the suffrage movement to secure women's rights to vote, the civil rights movement, in all of those instances, you had people who were bringing their religious convictions to the public square. Now, that was a much more religious age. To Dr. Christie's point, I mean, we're living in a much more secular age in certain ways. And so an individual or a group may decide, okay, given that fact, I will choose to make secular arguments. I will not make more explicit religious arguments. But people and groups and communities need to be free to act as they think is best, either from a secular perspective or from a religious perspective.
If I could, I completely agree with you. And actually, my husband and I argue a little bit because he's like, we have to be all secular. And I say to him, yeah, but the people who are in the trenches doing the work, like in the pregnancy resource centers, many of them are completely just overwhelmed with a religious fervor, to make known to the world that all human beings are created equal, right from the moment of conception. And we have to also respect that and make sure that that's possible, that religious fervor finds its outlet and is not trammeled by the terrible anti-religious forces that are crippling our country, in my opinion.
And the other freedom point goes to what you were talking about earlier, Gracie. So many girls and women don't feel like they're free to actually choose anything other than abortion. And that should be a place of common ground. If we can't agree on abortion itself, can we at least agree that a woman or a girl must have informed consent, know what she's getting into, and be able to choose something other than abortion if she so chooses. And the point about people being free to make religious arguments is so essential too, because not only because fundamentally it's what we are as a nation, but very often women do find consolation coming to know God's mercy and being able to trust in faith. And that's a gift that sometimes comes from some of these ministries. I know the Sisters of Life in New York and elsewhere have many stories where they do not force religion on women, but they're nuns. It's pretty clear that they love God and they're serving because they love God and they love that woman. They love that woman tapping into the love that God has for them. And so it's, of course, if that's going to bear fruit now and again, in terms of a woman wanting what they have to some extent. And so, freedom is so essential. Somebody asked the name of your husband's book. It's Speaking for the Unborn, 30-Second Pro-Life Rebuttals to Pro-Choice Arguments by Stephen Christie. And you can get it on Amazon or the Emmaus Road website as well. So Nathaniel, you've got this report. What do you want people to do with it?
In the end, we want it to be first and foremost a resource for pro-life communities, whether they're religious or not, pro-life organizations, but in general, people of goodwill and good faith. everyone, regardless of their religious background, regardless of their politics, regardless of how they see the world philosophically, should want an America in which organizations and religious institutions are not set on fire, do not have vile, intimidating graffiti sprayed on them, do not have mobs showing up and smashing their windows. And so in the end, what we want is for people to press their elected officials, government authorities, to take these things seriously, to end what is turning into a culture of impunity, to investigate, to arrest, to prosecute, and to condemn as well, so that it's very clear that these kind of attacks are just not acceptable into the United States. And then when it comes to the press, to push the media to just do its job, to ask themselves if this was any other group that was being attacked, any other group from any other religious background or view, would you be covering it? Would you be reporting on it? 63 organizations across 26 states in the District of Columbia in the case of pro-life organizations, 174 Catholic sites, mostly churches across 38 states plus the District of Columbia. As a media institution, would we cover it? I think the answer is probably yes. And so to also really challenge the press and the media to take their professional responsibilities and codes of ethics seriously.
Political violence is wrong on the right and it's wrong on the left. And we should be able to unanimously together state that as fact and cover it equally.
And one last point that I would make is that we've seen both in the United States, but also abroad as well, that when there is violence that's targeting particular communities, particular groups, and there's an absence of accountability, and there's a culture of impunity, the violence almost always grows in intensity, and in some cases in deadliness as well. And that's one of the things that we point out in the report, that, I mean, there are the incidents that have happened, the attacks that have happened, but unless there is a strong response from our government officials, from our elected representatives, from our law enforcement agencies, we can expect that these attacks are only going to grow in number and in deadliness.
Grazie, you mentioned earlier that at clinics like yours in Miami, nobody's bolting the door, not letting women go out. They can choose freely, even as you talk to them about the options for life, which include raising the child, also includes adoption. You talked about adoption earlier. The other thing I wanted to mention is many of these ministries also offer post-abortion healing resources. If you've had the abortion and you regret the abortion and you can acknowledge that and you want help, they're both religious, the majority are religious, but there are also secular opportunities, resources for post-abortion healing. Abortionchangesyou.org is one sort of clearinghouse for this kind of thing. So again, just focusing a light on what these resources are. They're not forcing women in any way to have abortions or trying to not have abortions. They're not brainwashing, they're not forcing religion. They're simply trying to serve. And in some states where the option to choose life is harder than in other states.
In Miami, where I am, or in South Florida, at Broward, most of our clients are Hispanic. Most of the people that come to the center, they want to keep their babies. There's a strong keep your baby ethos in our culture. The Hispanic family tends to be accepting of mistakes and embracing children from wherever they come from, and extended family pitches in to help out. And so what we tend to see in our center are women girls who want to keep their children. They're just simply, many of them are undocumented. Many of them are, living sort of in the gray economy. They have no access to, no direct access to healthcare, although we do, obviously, there is great healthcare for the undocumented here in Miami. Wonderful healthcare, actually. But they don't think that it exists. So those are some of the scenarios that we face, that we see when these women come into our centers. They do want to keep the baby. The father wants to keep the baby. The grandmother wants to keep the baby. The aunt will take the baby, but they don't see a way forward. So that's a scenario that we see. We're helping those women make the choice that they want to make. In a world where choice is the greatest good, in this modern world that we live in, we're just enabling women's free choices to, hold the child that's already inside them, to one day hold that child in their arms.
You mentioned how nondescript your particular clinic is, and that's the case in many places. I would dare say the vast majority, certainly the vast majority I've seen. And part of that is because you want this woman to know that she has some anonymity, that it's not this big "you're pregnant" sign, on the front door. And I love that reverence to her dignity, that so many of the clinics also have. And it's also not wanting to look political, because this issue is seen as so political. So we're at the end point. I want to give Nathaniel and Grazie a last word. So Nathaniel.
Ladies first.
Oh,
okay.
I would ask the viewers, anyone who might see this later, take care of your pregnancy resource centers in your area. Remember that we live from hand to mouth, from handout to mouth, I should say, and we do tremendous work. And if you get a chance to defend our work at anywhere you work or live, or in your politics and the way you vote, please do so, because the people that come to us, they need us, and we're enabling, the most beautiful choice of their lives that will save them from heartbreak for decades to come.
Kathryn, I would just say that these attacks, they're ugly, they're violent, but in the end, the response of Americans, whether they're religious or not, has to be charity. They have to respond to these things in a way that is not acting in kind. The response to these violent attacks is not to perpetrate more violence. It's to prevent it. It's to prepare for the possibility of it. It's to condemn it, but it is not to respond in kind. So we're hoping that this report is helpful for churches and other places of worship, for pro-life organizations that are at risk. And I think one underlying message here is that if you are a religious community, a religious organization that holds pro-life views, for example, you are at risk of attack. It may not be as great a risk as an organization or a place of worship in another location, but you are at risk. And it is vital that you prepare for it, that you take steps to prevent it, that you engage with your local representatives, with your U.S. representatives, with local law enforcement, to ensure that these things are prevented, and that we all take a stand against this kind of violence.
And I would encourage anyone watching this live or watching this after the fact on National Review Institute's YouTube page to share this conversation, to share the report that can be found at religiousfreedominstitute.org. And I think particularly valuable are, the numbers, but also the pictures. And if you can share some of the specific instances where this has been happening, I don't think people realize it. And I think we need to educate people, because there's not going to be a sense of urgency about it, and common cause outrage to prevent it if we don't know about it. So with that, thank you very much, Nathaniel and Grazie. Thank you for everyone who watched this live or is watching after. And I should say that Gracie's work can be found at thecatholicassociation.org, and defending religious freedom and liberty are a big part of what they do. And the report can be found at religiousrinstitute.org. And thank you, RFI, for co-sponsoring this with the National Review Institute. And if you go to nrinstitute.org, you can find all of what we're doing. And I see from my colleague Miranda that we have some cruise rooms left for November, if you're interested in that, nricruise.com. And I think none of us will be on it. We'll be working on land. But with that, thank you so much.
Thank you, Kathryn.
Thank you.